Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reef. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Sean, what are we getting into today?
So we're looking at a brand new case today, Miles. We are diving into a suspicious death, I guess is the best way to put it. This is a story about a woman named Casey Pitzer from Ohio, who in 2013 went missing for a week after a night out with friends and then was later recovered drowned in a retention pond. How she got there, what really happened that night, those are the questions we're going to be examining. And now, officially, this has been investigated and ruled an accidental death, an accidental drowning by a woman who was intoxicated and found her way into a body of water where she shouldn't have been. But once you look at the details and what actually happened and who saw her and some of the contradictions around those stories and timelines, this starts to look a lot more interesting. And Casey's family, who we're going to be interviewing along with their advocate and showing you over the coming weeks, definitely believe that the official conclusion here is not the correct one. We took a look at this case and we think that there's enough intriguing mystery here and definitely enough unanswered questions that it's worth talking about on this channel, even though it is officially sort of a closed case. We've done this before, right, Miles? We feel like it's worth bringing to the public's attention because if you listen to what the family has to say and look at the facts, it's kind of hard to imagine why this would be closed when so much remains unanswered. So, maybe the best place to start is let's talk about who Casey was, and then we can get into the events that transpired the night she disappeared and take it from there. What do you think, Miles?
Absolutely. Let's get into it. Okay, guys. So Casey Pitzer was a 32-year-old single mom. She had two young boys. She lived in Sabina, Ohio. According to all accounts that we've been able to get, she was a hard worker. She was there for her family. She was raising her kids. She had full custody of her children. The father wasn't involved. She had an ecosystem of friends and family around her that, she was actively involved with. She loved the outdoors. She loved animals. She was really, really involved with her kids, and she was really involved with her extended family, with her nieces and her nephews, and just all around pretty normal life. From what we could see, obviously, she was a single mom. She was managing that. She was taking care of her kids, and from what we understand, the night that she went out, the kids were being taken care of, and it was a night out for a young mom who needed to blow off some steam.
Yeah, and so I think what's important about this story, because we cover sometimes on this channel cases where someone has been out sort of partying or intoxicated and they later wind up deceased or missing, right? We've seen this a couple times. And one thing I should say is after talking to Casey's family, it doesn't seem like she was a party animal type person. It's important to remember like what Miles just said. This is a single mom who is having an opportunity on St. Patrick's Day to just go out for a little bit with some friends. So it wasn't like, some crazy blowout party where this woman was doing something irresponsible. She was a pretty normal person doing a pretty normal thing. So let's talk a little bit about what that was.
I think it's important to note because we have done a lot of cases where people have gone missing, especially when they've been partying or something along those lines. And these people sometimes have a history of substance abuse or alcohol abuse or something like that. And from what we could find, Casey was not one of those people. She was a working mom. She was a single mom. She was actively involved with her family. She didn't have any priors. She didn't have any record of drug abuse. That wasn't who this person was. This was a young woman who, as you'll see, had gone out for a night. It was a holiday. It was St. Patrick's Day, a night where everyone kind of lets loose, and she'd gone out to have a good time. And I think it's important to note that this wasn't someone who had a long record of arrests or drug abuse or anything like that in her history.
So, along for the ride are one of her friends named Tammy, as well as Tammy's adult daughter, Kendra, who is pregnant and therefore not going to be drinking and is going to be sort of a designated driver for the night, or that's the plan. And a couple of other folks, too, who will meet them at this Buffalo Wild Wings. But these are the primary characters: Tammy, Kendra, and of course, Casey. So they go to this Buffalo Wild Wings, they have some food, they have a little bit to drink, and then around 10:06, they decide to leave and go to a secondary location, which is a bar called Uncle Louie's. Uncle Louie's is just a classic sort of local bar, and they're having a St. Patrick's Day night. There's going to be dancing, obviously drinks, it's a bar, and all kinds of stuff. So they go there as sort of their final location for the night. And here's where things get a little bit interesting. So Kendra actually takes Casey's car, and Casey goes to this bar with two other friends named Jordan and Hannah, but everybody meets back up there again. So Tammy and Kendra come. Casey's car is there now, even though Casey didn't drive it, and Kendra has Casey's car keys. So inside of Uncle Louie's, for the next 2 hours, everybody's having fun, basically. There's a lot of footage of Casey dancing, socializing, but things do start to get a little strained as the night goes on. It seems like her friends want to leave and they want Casey to leave. In fact, there's an argument caught on camera between Tammy and Casey outside. And Casey basically keeps trying to go back into the bar. She succeeds a couple times. And ultimately, this leads to a situation where things have gotten a little bit acrimonious between the friends. And Casey decides to call her ex-boyfriend, Eric, to come pick her up. That call takes place at about 12:20 a.m. And after this, there is another scuffle. So she basically is able to go back in the bar. At this point, she becomes separated from her phone. It's not exactly clear how, but her friends would later wind up with it. So her keys, her phone, her purse, and her ID are not with her when she is back outside around 12:30, having yet another argument with Tammy about leaving. Keep in mind, she's already called her ex to come get her. He's not on the way yet, but she believes she's going to have a ride. And so, seeing this altercation between Tammy and Casey, the bouncers of the bar decide to get involved. And they basically tell her that she can't come back inside. Things get a little too heated. And in this moment, Casey decides, I've had enough, and she walks away. It's impossible to know what exactly was in her head at this moment, but there had been drinking now, there had been drama. She believed she had a ride home already on the way. And having basically been told to leave by the bouncer and not being allowed back into her stuff, this is where things start to get off the rails a little bit. So Casey decides to walk in the direction of her hometown, which is called Sabina. It's about 10 miles east of Wilmington, Ohio, where Uncle Louie's this bar is. So the last thing that we know basically is Casey walks out in that direction. A couple minutes later, they would later discover a Walmart security cam video that caught a figure walking in that direction that looks like it is likely to be Casey, although it's not confirmed. It's possible that it's somebody else, but it looks like it's likely to be her, which would confirm, yes, that's where she was going. So, as this is happening and Casey is walking away towards her hometown, Kendra, who is sober and has by now linked up with her boyfriend, a guy named Mike Hartley, who will become important, is trying to figure out what to do about all this. She knows that Casey has stormed off and she has Casey's car and her keys, and between her and her mom, Tammy, also her wallet, her ID, her phone, basically everything that you would want to have with you if you were going off alone into the night. It's important to note Casey had none of that. This is all sort of dispersed between her friends. So, interestingly enough, after the figure that may or may not be Casey disappears from the Walmart camera around 12:39 a.m., some of these people start to converge on that parking lot with Casey's car. So we have Mike Hartley, Kendra, both in Casey's car, go to Walmart and they're going to meet up with Brandon Reed, who is a friend of Mike's that Mike calls to come help in the search. Brandon, it's important to note, had been at a gas station filling up his Taurus with $30 worth of gas, he would later tell police, when he was contacted by Mike to come help in the search for Casey. Kendra basically is recruiting these two guys to go find her friend and give her a ride home. So Brandon meets them in this Walmart parking lot at 12:44, minutes after Casey, if that was her on the camera, would have just left. At this point, Mike leaves Kendra, who is with Casey's car, and gets in Brandon Reed's Taurus, the one that was just filled up with gas, and they leave at around 12:44 to go find Casey. Now, from here on out, we get into their version of events because this next part of the story is only told by the subjective viewpoint of Brandon and Mike. And Casey's family and the advocates have pointed out that some of this can be called into question by other pieces of evidence, but the best thing to do is probably just go through what they said first, and then we'll examine it.
Now, according to both Hartley and Reed, they connect. They're riding in Brandon's car. They see Casey walking along the road. Now, they both say that she's kind of swaying like she's drunk, that she's a bit disoriented, and they offer her a ride. Now, Brandon, sorry, Mike tells Casey, according to his account to police, that he tells Casey that he is Kendra's boyfriend and that they know each other through her because they actually weren't acquainted, and that's how he gets her to get into the car. This is what he tells cops, like, hey, you know me, I'm Kendra's boyfriend, basically, and I'm here to help you out. So instead of heading directly towards Casey's house, they actually turn around and start traveling in a different direction. And they would later tell police that this was because the car that they were driving needed gas, which is a claim that contradicts what Brandon had said earlier, which is that he had gotten the phone call while he was actually gassing up his car. Now, this is one of several contradictions that will come up between their statements to police. According to both statements, though, when they're driving, soon after they turned around, Casey became upset. She attempted to exit the vehicle. She crosses the roadway and she disappears. And they both say this is the last time that they ever saw Casey Pitzer.
So one interesting thing about Brandon and Mike's story is that, um, hearing it in totality, you have to sort of force it to conform to the reality of what's shown on the Walmart security camera, the same one that may have caught Casey walking and that caught Mike and Kendra in Casey's car pull up, and then Mike get out and get into Brandon's car and leave. Now that happened at 12:44. According to their story, it would have been about 12:45, 12:46, very shortly thereafter that they encountered Casey walking on the road, got her in the car, and that all of this stuff that Miles just told us happened. But what's interesting is by 12:53, less than 10 minutes later, Brandon's car is back in the Walmart parking lot. So we know that they left at 12:44, and we know that 9 minutes later they're back. Was that enough time for them to actually locate Casey, convince her to get in the car, start driving one way, decide they need to go back another way, and for all these events to unfold where she gets out of the car and runs, and then they go start looking for her, which they did tell police they did. That timeline is important because the family believes that it's so short that it may call into question these guys' version of events. It's possible that that's just not enough time for everything to have transpired that they later said transpired in that 9 minutes. Of course, that is a subjective viewpoint of the family. I will leave it to you guys to sort of do the math on that and figure out if you think that could be true. But it is interesting because, when we have them on camera leaving and coming back, those are two established points of reality that don't have to come from the subjective story of Brandon and Mike. Like we can see that on camera. We know that that happened. Whether or not their story fits into it is another question. So let's move on.
So next morning, Casey obviously she doesn't come home, right? So the ex-boyfriend who had actually been the one that had come down to the bar, who she had called that night, he goes out, he starts looking for her. He gets in touch with the family. The family becomes alarmed, and then search efforts kind of explode, right? Eventually, it's an official search. Hundreds of people participate. There's ATVs involved. There's people on foot. Dogs are brought out. They even go into the retention pond with the sonar team. So the retention pond is a really, really important thing here. So there's a retention pond that was newly constructed that was off the roadway where Casey had run across. Now, during the search, a dog reportedly tracked scents directly to this pond. And what's found there is kind of a major discovery, which is Casey's boots that the family had identified as a newly purchased pair of black and teal boots. They were pretty distinctive. And when they were told that, this is when the family says that they realized that something was seriously wrong. So the searching goes on for about a week. Then on March 24th, 2013, Casey's body is recovered from that retention pond. And that's when obviously the search ends and the family has to kind of deal with the next steps.
So what happens next here is even more bizarre. So obviously, I don't think anybody that knew Casey expected her to be found in a pond, right? She had left in the middle of the night. This pond would have been off the roadway in a fairly dark, unlit area. So the question is, how did she get there? If the story is true that she had jumped out of these guys' car and run off into the night, how would she wind up in this pond? Well, the investigation ultimately concludes what the family believes to be a little bit prematurely. They do an autopsy on Casey, and they determine that the cause of death is drowning and that the contributing factor is acute intoxication. In other words, she was drunk, she went into the water, and she drowned. And that's pretty much where they left it. As far as why she would be there or if somebody had something to do with her getting there, Not much was done. Obviously, the guys that were really important here are Brandon Reed and Mike Hartley, and they were questioned by police, and they were actually given a polygraph exam before Casey was even found. 4 days before the body turns up, they're already looking at these guys as, okay, you're the last people to see this missing woman alive. Let's get a polygraph going and start asking you some questions. And the family is told that they pass. So, really, at this point, it seems like law enforcement believes this was an accident, right? These guys, they're pretty convinced had nothing to do with it and that they're being truthful in their statements despite the discrepancy about the gas. And they think that Casey basically panicked when they turned the car around and ran out and somehow wound up in this body of water where she drowned because she was had drank too much. Now, some things don't add up, right? And I'm going to go through a little list of the objections that have been raised by Casey's family and their advocate, who we will meet next week. So, why do we feel like this official conclusion may not be the full story here? Well, the biggest objection of all is how would Casey have reached this pond? When you look at this pond, it is off the road in a very dark, unlit area. There was mud that night, mud so deep that when the police went there to search for her, they actually had to lay down wooden planks just to get across the mud all around this pond. And then after the mud, a fence. So, how would a woman in Casey's condition in the middle of the night in pitch black and also very cold temperatures, because this is March in Ohio, get across all of that over the fence and into the pond? And also, for what reason, right? The family has no answers for this, and they believe that law enforcement hasn't provided any. And they feel like this alone is enough to say there are unanswered questions, and an investigation needs to be done into why and how. Right? It's not enough to just say, "Oh, she was in the water and she drowned." How did she get there and why? This is not a normal place for a person to be. Another objection here from the family has to do with material evidence, specifically Casey's clothing that was recovered from her body when she was, extricated from the pond by law enforcement. Her body went to a funeral home. The funeral home destroyed her clothing, which the family found out when they tried to get it because they wanted to find out if there was anything forensically important, right? They wanted to try to preserve that. But it seems like law enforcement never even got to examine that clothing. Nothing was done to try to pull maybe DNA evidence off of it or even just save it for a later date in case it became important. This funeral home just incinerated it, from what we're told. So the family's very upset about that. And that is not normal practice, right? Well, typically the way that this works is even in a strange death or a homicide, the person's personal belongings are maintained either for evidence, or if they're not going to be evidence, they're given over to the family because even though they might be grimy and mucky and even have, fluids from a person on them, they're still somebody's property. They don't belong to the funeral home. It's not really their purview to burn that stuff. So that's really unusual and very odd. The family's very upset about that. The other thing is the boots. So we mentioned earlier that Casey's boots, these very unique boots, were seen on the shoreline, I guess you could call it, like just outside the pond, as though she had taken them off and placed them there. So these boots of hers were never handed over to the family either. No one seems to know where they went. Even photographs of the boots from the day that they were found have gone missing, right? The family has tried to get all of these records. They have had success in court, basically forcing the police to hand over some of the stuff, but this is missing. So even when they're given all the files, there's no photos of the boots. Nobody knows where they were. And it's just odd. It's odd that everything Casey was wearing has disappeared. The family feels like that is such important evidence, especially given the fact that she was last in the company of two men, right? And we're all basically putting faith in their version of this story. But some of the facts don't make sense, like we're talking about. And so you would think that in a situation like that, you'd want to go to the forensic evidence to really tell the tale. Are these guys being truthful? Is there more to the story? The last little bit of huge issue that we have here is that the autopsy photos were heavily redacted when they were given to the family. There's a lot that you cannot see, which is sort of unusual for autopsy photos, which are usually very thorough, extremely graphic. Those are photos that famously don't shy away from the difficult details. But the ones given to the family do, which is troubling because they just don't provide a lot of answers. An interesting thing, though, is that photos from the scene of her body recovery, photos actually from the retention pond when she was pulled out, show that she has a clump of grass in her hand. It also shows discoloration around her neck. Now, those two things together are extremely alarming if your theory is that she went in there for a swim. Why the discoloration around the neck? How does that happen? And also, if you're just taking off your clothes and getting in a body of water, why are you clutching grass in your fist? It almost seems more like maybe something happened on the ground and she was struggling and trying not to go in that water and grabbed grass. Again, that's just what this suggests to me. I don't think we know for sure what happened, but you guys be the judge. I mean, it kind of doesn't make sense. You can see why the family is alarmed that there's not more of an investigation into this and that it's being written off as an accident when you look at all those objections that I just laid out.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, from our conversations with the family, the autopsy photos that they received, not only did they have Casey's face sort of blacked out and blurred, but that part of her throat was also obscured, which is very strange because if you look at the crime scene photo, you can clearly see this mark. So it is a bit odd when it all adds up. Something else to note that's really important is that earlier Sean mentioned that both Hartley and Reed had undergone a polygraph tests when they came in. They were both put on it, and they both participated. Now, again, as Sean mentioned earlier, one particular detective told the family, according to Greg, that both men had passed with quote unquote flying colors. Now, when records were gotten later and gone through, it showed a different story. That actually one of the gentlemen was listed as being deceptive, and one of them was his results were listed as inconclusive. The argument from the family and from other advocates for Casey have said that it's odd that there's no meaningful follow-up that's occurred with this, right? Now, another interesting point is that in 2025, Hartley voluntarily comes back in and undergoes another polygraph examination. Now, again, according to the records, he was retested and he failed again. So he was again found to be deceptive, according to the records that we've seen. So, look, we all know this, but I'm going to say it. Polygraphs are never really accepted as proof of guilt. They're typically designed to produce results of whether someone's being deceptive in their answers. It's more a way to test emotional reaction to something and stress when asked certain questions than it is exactly what the answer is, right? So it's inconclusive. It's not an official thing that you can look at and say, yes, this person's guilty. But again, I do think it's important to note, especially with Riley telling the family that they passed with flying colors and the records later showing that that was just not true. Is an odd thing.
Yeah, and it's important to note, guys, like we don't even know what specific questions he was asked and which ones would have been indicated as being deceptive, right? It's entirely plausible that there was deception detected around questions that were just establishing a baseline or had to do with small details unrelated to Casey. They ask all kinds of things in these interviews. I think it's more important to look at this as sort of one more arrow in the quiver of things don't add up, right? This isn't the big thing on which the case turns, but it's also impossible to ignore, right? You would want, if you're Mike Hartley, to go in there and actually pass with flying colors like the family was told the first time. That would be
Right.
the ideal outcome, but that's not what happened.
One other thing to note is that the car that Casey was riding in that night that she got into with the two gentlemen, as far as we know, it was never processed. There's no records of it ever being processed. So there was no forensic examination of that car. There was no testing for DNA. There was no, what you would usually do in a situation where there's two men and a woman and the woman ends up dead. You kind of want to, pursue all avenues. And from what we can see, that was actually never done. So, just to kind of sum it up, I mean, there's questions regarding the car. There's questions regarding how the photographic evidence was handled, and there's also questions regarding like just pure evidence preservation, right? From the clothing to the boots to everything else around this crime scene. There doesn't seem to be much left. Another thing that's been brought up is the existence of a rape kit. Now, you would think that if a woman's body is pulled out of a pond, and again, she had been picked up by these two men, and that was the last time she was seen, that it would be standard operating procedure to process a rape kit on her body. Um, there's been several different stories told about whether or not there was even a rape kit. So apparently, some people say that there was a rape kit that existed and that it was later destroyed with other evidence. But that's the records that the family's been able to get, is that there actually was a rape kit, but that it was sort of destroyed. And they didn't even know that there had been a rape kit processed for years and years and years until they started working with an outside advocate who you'll see we interviewed along with Greg. So one of the primary complaints that Greg Pitzer has had all these years is that a lot of evidence was either mishandled or that it was destroyed. And, going through the paperwork that we've gotten and, diving into this case, it's kind of hard to disagree with him on that. So, one more controversy, because we don't have enough in this case, kind of is around the phone records. Okay. So, we do know that a grand jury subpoenaed records for 7 phones, but we only know one of those phones. And one of those phones was Casey's. All of the other phones have been kept private. So there's 6 phones whose records were subpoenaed that we do not know who they were, never mind what was in those phone records. Now, the excuse given to the family of why this information hasn't been released is because they were for possible suspects in the case. But if you think about
Uncharged,
it,
uncharged suspects is what they say.
sorry, uncharged suspects, right, which is my favorite phrase that I learned covering this case. So, as Sean said, these phones belong to uncharged suspects, but this is an open shut case of accidental drowning under extreme intoxication, according to the same police who are telling the family that they can't give them the phone records because they belong to uncharged suspects. It's a bit odd. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. One thing to note is that Casey's available phone records did reportedly show that there were calls to the ex-boyfriend, which lines up with the last time that she used her phone. So maybe we should get into what people think, right? Because there's a lot of theories around this case, as there always are in cases like this. And let's just kind of walk through a few of them, and Sean and I can kind of give you our uneducated opinion on how we feel about it. So, something that does come up is Casey did something to herself, that she ended herself that night, right? And this idea does appear periodically online, in various message boards, Facebook groups, and stuff like that. Now, the idea is that, the theory is that she had been suffering depression because she had broken up with her ex. And supposedly there were some texts on her phone that sort of suggested that she was feeling hopeless. But the response to that from the family has been like, this is a woman who was raising 2 children. She had never shown any suicidal ideation leading up to this. She'd never been that person. So, all of a sudden on, St. Patrick's Day, she gets into a fight with her friend and she decides to get into a car with 2 strangers, jump out and drown herself in a retention pond. For everyone who knew her, it doesn't track.
No, I mean, look, she had children. Her life was going well. There was no indication that she had the kind of troubles that would lead to something like that happening, right? Um, let's
Well,
see.
the
So
other
should I?
theory is that she, was really drunk, decided to take a swim and drowned. That's also been put out there. I believe that that's actually even mentioned in that documentary that was done on this case. Again, seems very strange to be, taking a ride with these guys. According to them, she jumps out of the car in distress, and then she decides to take a leisurely swim in a retention pond.
One thing that's really interesting to me, Miles, about that theory and about this whole night is that, after speaking to Casey's father, Greg, and the family's advocate, everyone who came forward to talk about Casey that night describes her as being really intoxicated, swerving around when she's walking, just like dead drunk, basically. But when you look at the videos of her inside the bar, and even, like Miles said, the figure seen walking in the Walmart camera, which seems like it's likely to be Casey, although it's possible that it's not. They tell a very different story. You don't see her even take a drink during the last half hour in that bar. She's just dancing and hanging out, and she seems in full control of her physical, capacities, walking straight, talking with people. And so it's just odd that everyone's describing her as falling down drunk when we can see on the camera that she doesn't seem to be. So it's just interesting that everyone's describing her as so drunk that she would, climb over a fence and get into a body of water. Like it seems like you would have to be that drunk to make such a weird decision, but it's just not on the tape, and I'm troubled by that. Do we want to talk about the bill at the bar, Miles? Because I think that's really interesting too.
So yeah, the bill is a really, really interesting little anomaly because Casey's bill says that she ordered over a dozen shots, and I think it was like 8 beers. This is a small framed woman. Okay. And I think if we're being, realistic, her doing over 12 shots and drinking 8 beers, just, it doesn't seem realistic. I don't think she would have been walking out of that bar at all. But it has been used as sort of evidence of how inebriated she was. Like, well, look at what she ordered that night. And it seems more likely that she probably was running a tab and that there were multiple people drinking on that tab.
But that's how a bar tab goes, right? I mean, you buy your friends drinks, they buy you drinks, and at the end of the night, I think it can be a deceptive document because you'll see 12 shots of tequila, but that was distributed to three or four people over multiple rounds. And so I would be very surprised if a bar would even serve a single woman, 13, 14, 15 shots of liquor in one night. Like they're not in the business of killing people. That's not a safe thing to do. So I don't read a lot into that receipt personally.
I no, totally agree. I totally agree. But it has been talked about. It has been pointed to as evidence that she was, really, really, really inebriated. Um, let's talk about what the current status of the case is, Sean.
Yeah, well, look, this is the reason that we're actually sitting down here today talking about this, and it's the reason that we interviewed Casey's father and some other people who are currently advocating for her case. So, what we know is that it remains officially an accidental drowning. We know that Greg, her father, has spent well over a decade now pushing and advocating and going to city council meetings and going to court trying to force not only just an answer for why it hasn't been further investigated, but reignite an investigation. Like there's two parts of this almost. It's why hasn't this been handled over the last 13 years? And also, can we please start handling it now? And that's the mission. We know that this doesn't make a lot of sense if you look at it for all the reasons that we've laid out. I would be so surprised if Casey Pitzer actually got out of that car, walked all the way back through this town, another mile in the other direction, off of a road, through some mud, climbed over a fence, took off her boots, put them on the shore of this retention pond, and then just went in and accidentally drowned. Why would anybody do that? Right? Even a really drunk person, even if we go down the road of saying she was really drunk, it still doesn't make that much sense. Especially now when you look at the last two men to have seen her alive, the fact that their stories kind of don't make sense, the fact that they're failing polygraph tests, which is, you know, there's a lot to be said about that, but it's part of the story. And I'm not saying that these guys necessarily did something to her. I'm just saying, doesn't it feel like we would want to rule that out when there's a lot of evidence that their version of the night doesn't add up? Maybe something else happened. Maybe the reason they're being deceptive is because there was some other type of accident that took place. I don't know. It just seems like we don't have the full answer here. And for a family like the Pitzers, not to have a real answer and feel like this isn't being taken seriously is itself a crime. It's a different kind of crime, right? It's an injustice. We all want to think that if something like this happens to a family member, it's taken seriously and handled and that we'll get an answer. And I think the Pitzer family deserves that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, there's a lot of things that are, I think should be answered, right? And I think if law enforcement wants to stop the family's efforts and stop all these other people who are now advocating for Casey, I think they could just, come out and try to address some of these questions, right? Like, why did they actually say accidental drowning? Like, what's the evidence that's supporting that? Like, what's the evidence that's supporting that she intentionally got into that body of water and accidentally drowned? Um, at the same time, is there anything that's actually pointing towards foul play? I think we could probably cover that in another video, and I think we probably will, but probably not for us to get into right now. Um, why were Casey's boots allegedly separated from her? It's very convenient that they were sitting on the edge of that water, right? As if she had taken them off to go swim. So if she did accidentally drown, I guess that would track that she had taken off the boots and then gotten into the water. But then how come the boots have never come up? How come we just heard about them, but there's no photographs of them, and the family never got the boots? So really, those are some major questions that I think should be answered. Why did those guys go away from the route that she was on if they had gas in their car? Was one of them misspeaking? Was one of them misspeaking when he said that he had been filling up his car when he got the call? It's a very specific thing to say. I'm at a gas station. I get a call from a friend. Can you come help me with something? I just put $30 into my tank, and now I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go meet him and take care of this, favor that we said we were going to do. But then why did they turn around and go the other way and then say that they were doing that because they had to get gas? It's very, very strange, right?
It is very,
Um,
very strange.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, the big question is: were Hartley and Reed investigated sufficiently? Right? Was enough time put into trying to find out if the story that these guys told were true or not? And who are these guys, and what are their possible connections in this locale? And that's stuff that we'll get into in subsequent videos, for sure. You'll see when we interview Greg, and what's the other guy's name?
Daryl
You'll see what's his last name?
Petrie,
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 thank you.
said
Petrie.
Petrie. Yeah.
You'll see when we interview Greg, Casey's father, and his advocate, Daryl Petrie, that there's what was I talking about? Uh where they investigated significantly. Sorry, man.
Yeah, no,
Um,
no, no. I think that's where you're good. Yeah.
yeah. There's a lot of opinions about this from the family and from the family's advocate, Daryl Petrie, and you'll see when we interview them that they have a lot to say about this. What happened to the records? What happened to the evidence? What happened to Casey's clothes? Why are the autopsy photos all redacted in that way? Why do the crime scene photos show one thing, and then the autopsy photos, like her throat is obscured in the blur? This is again, very odd. Explain it. Why isn't that being explained? I think, if when lots of anomalies pop up, it's sometimes that happens. But I think if you don't address it, then it lends itself to conspiratorial thinking, right? So if these questions could be answered, I think there would be less of a controversy around this case, right? So overall, you know, were there investigative failures on this case? Was there mishandling of evidence, was there a lack of robust investigation into the two people that are supposed to be the ones who last saw Casey alive? And also, can both of these things be true? Could the investigation have been mishandled, but that the conclusion is still correct? That, Casey did accidentally drown? Is that possible? Yes, of course. Of course. Is there some like level of embarrassment because the investigation was mishandled and like evidence was destroyed when it shouldn't have been? And so it's kind of being swept under the rug, but at the end of the day, the story is what they say it is. That's quite possible. But again, without addressing it head on, I think that's the issue. That's the issue that I see with this case mostly is a lack of communication from law enforcement, and a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, and that's why we've decided to talk about this because look, there's a version of this where it makes sense, right? Where the drowning makes sense, and that version looks like this. The rape kit still exists and it came up negative. We see the phone records of everybody involved because they're not considered uncharged suspects, right? In an accidental death. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But we get to see everybody's phone records, who spoke to who, what they did, where they went, and everything adds up. In this version, the last two people to see her alive passed their polygraph tests, and there's no deception. In this version of events, their story doesn't contradict itself about where they were going and how much gas was in the car and why they turned around. Um, in that version, I could see an accidental drowning. It still would be very strange to me that this woman who just had her act together and was a mom and just wasn't a crazy person would decide to make a crazy decision like going into that pond in the middle of a frigid night where there's no one around and it's dark. I still wouldn't understand that. But when all these other things added up, I'd be like, okay, well, maybe. But the fact that none of it does just makes me feel like, yeah, this investigation seems like it should not be over yet. And it, like you said, Miles, it could still lead to an accident. But it just feels like there's all these things, these boxes that are unticked, these things that any rational, normal person would say, why don't we look at that? Can we at least rule this other stuff out that's so suspicious before we get to accident? I see where the family's coming from. I don't personally pretend to know what happened that night, but I do see the questions that they're asking, and I view those questions as very legitimate. And I don't think these people are crazy at all for wanting to have all of this stuff raised, presented to the public, and have a big deal made out of it. They should.
Agreed. And again, as long as you're not robustly addressing concerns from the public and from the family, you're going to end up in a place where people start thinking conspiratorially and they start connecting the dots. And when you're in a place the size of this town, people are invariably connected. And that leads to lots of ideas about, why things may have happened the way they did. And these are, yes, I'm being a bit vague right now, okay? But you guys will see. We're going to get into that. If you're going to watch our interview with Greg and with Daryl, and you're going to see what I'm talking about. And I think that I think that Sean and I will eventually do a kind of like suspects and theories video for this one, where we get a little bit deeper into some of the anomalies that are surrounding this case, because it is pretty crazy.
It is. It is. And I have to say, the one thing that I keep returning to, this is such a small detail, but it's just the grass in her hand really bothers me. I think there's like a visual element to that that sort of sticks with you. I mean, I guess you could leave open the idea that maybe this retention pond was really just a steep drop off from the land to the water, and she was trying to climb back out after falling in. But, something about it just
She was
feels a
found
little,
pretty far out.
it seems a little more sinister than that too. It's just a gut feeling. I don't know. I don't know. Again, question that I would love to have answered along with all of the other ones in this case.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that if you were trying to swim, if you slid into the pond and you would grab the grass and you fell in the pond and then you were trying to swim, I mean, I look, anything could happen, but you would think that your hands would open and you would actually try to paddle. Whereas if something else had happened and then your body was put into the pond, you perhaps would still be holding on to whatever that was.
That's certainly the way that it looks to me. Until proven otherwise, that's where my gut goes to. Well, guys,
Yeah.
what do you think? I mean, we've raised a lot of issues here that are
We've
all,
gotten a lot more theoretical than we usually do in a case breakdown, I have to say.
yeah, we have. And I think it's because of the nature of the case is just about asking these unanswered questions. This isn't
Right.
one where it's not typical, right? This is a strange case. And I think that that's why this is a strange case breakdown. But as usual, we'd love to hear your
Well,
guys' thoughts.
it would be kind of be professional malpractice on our part to just like lay out the facts as the authorities have told us, because honestly, you guys would just be like, that doesn't make sense. You guys are idiots.
Right,
I mean, I feel
right.
like if we literally just said the story, it really wouldn't make any sense. So we
Oh,
kind
there
of
would be
have to
nothing to
comment
talk
on it.
about. We'd say, here's a closed case of a woman who accidentally drowned.
After
That's
jumping out of a car with two guys who were going the wrong way in a car that needed gas, but that had already been filled up, and yeah, who failed polygraphs. It's all very strange. Anyway, yes, as Sean was saying, we would love to know what you guys think. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this case. And even if you're not, let us know what you think. And obviously, usually what happens in a case like this is that people who are from the area will tune in. They'll see our video and they'll start talking about it and they'll start sending us private messages, giving us information. So you have at it. If anybody's watching from the area and anybody knows any of the people involved or involved in the story, I should say, please, please, please feel free to either drop a comment, send us a private message, and we will put up all of the information at the end of this video for where people can send any tips or anything like that, and also Casey's dad's website and everything else.
sounds good. Well, guys, stay tuned. More to come on this case next week. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
Absolutely.